So this is the 6th in a series of 7 sessions called Radical Presence from GreenChristian.org.uk. And this session is called Tomb. And welcome, my name's Imogen Nay.
And I'm Andy Griffiths.
And it's interesting to wonder why at this time in the course that the course has chosen the theme of tomb. And the story of Lazarus, because it sort of alludes to perhaps something we might have thought about earlier on in terms of focusing on loss, but it does, of course, also point to new life. But naming our losses, I think, is incredibly important.
And our conversations over the last few weeks have touched on loss and new life, on lament and hard hope. And I guess a seasonal way to say that lament is an essential part of the process is to say that everyone winters at one time or another, and some winter over and over again. We need a language of grief, both so that we can put our own grief into words and so that we can build empathy.
And I think it's something that perhaps we have forgotten how to do well, to lament and grieve, especially in a culture that's framed by capitalism, which is always about growth. And the cycle of nature and the seasons teaches us something very different. But of course, we are in the season of remembrance in mid-November, and we engage in intentional remembering around Remembrance Day. But in my reading this year, I've been struck by the fact that there are some things that we seem to have forgotten. We're very good, and of course we should be, at remembering the loss of life in the 2 world wars in the 20th century. But the Spanish flu, which was a worldwide epidemic, saw the loss of life, something extraordinary, between 50 to 100 million people. So what does our forgetting tell us also about who we are? I was particularly struck by something that I found, which I sent out on the PowerPoint presentation, and that was the AIDS memorial. We have many, many war memorials around our world, but not so many that focus on loss of life through disease. And that war memorial, I thought, AIDS memorial was particularly poignant. You can see what I loved about it was the way in which it managed to focus on individual loss and individual stories. But then in the presentation of it, you've got the large scale perspective. So you can see something of just the number of lives and the extent of the grief that the world was coping with through that illness.
And I was interested that the organization that put the original ideas and materials together for this, who are called GreenChristian, as part of their Radical Presence project, they talk about, I'm quoting, a site, S-I-T-E, a site which plants in wood or stone the shared but tender dream of a better post-pandemic world. We call artists and craftspeople, landscapers, poets and architects, fine art departments of universities, civic leaders and people of faith. We invite proposals, they say, but also questions. What if, as well as a war memorial, which is really important, there was a pandemic memorial of some kind?
What we want to do tonight is to just think a little bit about what that might look like, so that we are enabled to remember the lessons of this pandemic, to help people in the future because something that I've been so incredibly struck by as I've been reading about the Spanish flu is that all the things that we're going through now were gone through before, but we've entirely forgotten those lessons. And what a shame. So if a memorial can help us name our loss, honor that loss, but also stop us forgetting, what a powerful thing that would be. But this is coming out of particularly our conversations over the last 2 weeks, trying to bring together under sort of 3 headings initially about the sort of core themes that were coming out. So the first core theme was hard, contagious hope. How might we express that? Thinking about the hope of the cross, which is difficult, challenging, fragile, but ultimately glorious. Think about Lazarus coming out of the tomb. How might we take that forward? We talked about accepting vulnerability and showing empathy. Jesus as the model. Could we tell his story in a particular way? So one idea I had was perhaps writing a Christian course based on vulnerability. Then the second major theme was empathy and compassion, a new awareness of grief and human suffering. We've been touching on that again tonight about relearning the language of lament. Human grief as a normal part of experience, and churches helping people to learn this language. And there is one particular Church of England project, and they've produced some cards called Grave Talk, and they enable you to host cafes for people to talk about grief. So that's one idea. And the other major theme we talked about was sort of local, knowing your neighbours, who lives around you, and letting go of heroism and the fix-it attitude to a very different way of operating in our communities, mutuality and reciprocity. So that might look like one of the allotment or food share schemes. I found a charity called Lend and Tend. You can lend your garden, or you can go and volunteer in someone else's garden and share the produce. Who might we partner with in our local communities? Bearing in mind, we all come from places across the UK. So it's thinking about local earth, simple community responses for each of us. So they were the sort of the big themes, and we just need to tap down a bit more this evening to think about which sort of actual particular projects we might want to take on.
So we've been talking about lament and remembering, and in the group I was with, our conversation moved in the direction of books, because Sue is going to produce a book about 2020 for her family members, particularly younger members of family who are like 2 or 4 years old at the moment. They won't remember 2020 unless they're given a book or something, doesn't matter what, that actually talks them through the happy but also the sad things about this, and the sort of ecologically relevant things about this, that are about the way that we have failed to learn some lessons, and maybe can pass that on. Catherine.
Space for, again, younger people, perhaps the younger generation a little bit older than 2 to 4 year olds, but school children and young people in their first job. And Emma made the point that there are lots of people working in care homes who are just 18 or 19 and have perhaps never faced loss before, and then suddenly are losing scores of patients that they've cared for and got close to during the process of caring for them. And then we thought a bit also about, Philip talked about the way young people express their loss and express what's been going on, and they write very succinct truisms about it all, with wisdom that we older people perhaps wouldn't have or use.
Just touching on what Emma was saying, I would just like to add, perhaps having in terms of a memorial, perhaps having groups for people that have lost loved ones, where they can get together and sort of share experiences. And I don't know, it's just something that came to mind as I heard what Emma was saying.
I think the thing that really struck me was, you know, how easy it could be to forget. And also when someone was saying, you know, the way that we remember the wars, or, you know, it's different, and people can provide a single story of what happened. And I think just the importance of just having a collective of stories, because they've been all different experiences, and there's been some joy and there's been lots of sorrow, and having those different perspectives is really important, so that some bigger political people don't create a political single story for their own means.
So actually, I think mine follows on quite nicely from Haranya, in that I think in our group, listening to kind of just a real understanding of the grief that's being felt by so many people, but then how we balance that with the kind of Christian hope, I guess, that we have and want to display. And I still loved, Andy, your contagious hopefulness last week, in terms of kind of the faith that we have that underlies all this. So I think it's about trying to find, as individuals and as communities, the right balance between kind of accepting and recognizing the loss and properly grieving that, but also looking forward with hope, and also recognizing the bits of joy and light that have been in this period as well. So that's probably where I've come out with.
Shelley's poem Ozymandias has isn't it? It's a statue which is to recall a great and mighty emperor, and the statue is smashed, and the traveller who finds it in the desert can just read on it the inscription, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." And as I said in the group earlier, humility is a tremendously powerful thing in the face of these, and that's really what I've taken away from today, really.
There's a recent statue that's got a huge amount of criticism, hasn't there? Is it?
Mary
It's a female.
Wollstonecraft.
Is it Mary Wollstonecraft? Very bizarre. Yeah, sorry.
Well, I was very struck by what we heard about, that there is already a physical memorial that's currently on display in Sheffield Cathedral, and that's sort of based on steel, because it's Sheffield, on steel maple sycamore leaves, 5,000 of them, which is, you know, is supposed to represent those who have died, and that apparently will be doing some sort of tour around. So whether it will come to us or not, we don't know, but it might be that, you know, that being part of that national thing, in the same way that in the with the sort of centenary of the First World War, that sort of big display of poppies around the Tower of London and things, that was then sort of dispersed and things, became a sort of national sense. There may be some potential in some way to you know, to do something that people can then maintain it as a sort of memory, I think, perhaps.
A lot of the points have been made already, but I think the word hope, I think, comes through in my mind as being an important one, and maybe a chance to reflect on what we mean by hope. You know, is it we hope that there won't be any more deaths? We hope that the vaccine will work. Well, that's one type of hope, but you know, or is it about hopefulness? And maybe hope and hopefulness, in a sense, could be a major part of the memorial. I mean, I think we've all talked about a memorial that is not just a physical thing, but all manner of things that will be as relevant in 100 years' time, in a couple of 100 years' time, as it is now. Technology is changing so that we have got the means to articulate something to enable us to think back, or future generations to think back, and again, using the resourcefulness and almost the simplicity of thinking, but the wise thinking of young people to articulate some of the thoughts that we as adults try and put into complex language, but to have hope in the generation that is coming through, and future generations, that they will, in a sense, be looking into the future.
I guess I felt quite challenged by how we share the hope of the cross to people who largely see faith as something irrelevant. And I'm not necessarily sure that the pandemic changes that in a big way. But just kind of as I've sort of mulled that round in my mind, I've been thinking that maybe those actual words come a bit later, and the important thing is that as Christians and as the church, we're there for people, that churches feel places people naturally want to come to, places that they can be listened to, that they can find acceptance. Maybe that the Christian message is communicated in ways that don't always involve words, maybe through artwork, maybe through music, maybe just through Christian people living out their Christian lives and being who they are, but kind of wearing that badge, if you like, of being inspired by faith. And maybe if we get that right, we kind of earn the right to tell our story later.
My idea of a book was really for my grandchildren, because they're experiencing this, although my daughter is trying to minimize any effect on them, but it will have an effect on the little ones, the small children. So I just thought I would compose a book about the year, really, the strange year we've had, that I could share with them when they're a bit older. And also, after what you've all said, we do have short memories, don't we? And a lot of us said we couldn't even remember some of the things that happened in the first lockdown that really meant a lot to us at the time. And unless you keep a diary of your thoughts and of what happens out there, it's difficult to think back. So we do need to have some form of memorial. I was also thinking, as everyone was speaking, that it would be good, the school where I'm a governor, I might see if I can do some sort of project with the children in a year's time and get them to talk about their memory of the pandemic and what it meant to them as well.
Peter and Sally were saying, Peter, about the installation in Sheffield Cathedral, and I was wondering, artists and musicians have had quite a bad time during this pandemic, and wouldn't it be wonderful if every cathedral could commission a work of art and a musical composition to help us remember that pandemic through artistic life? We're a great cultural country, and the church has always been encouraging culture in lots of different ways through its music and artwork, and maybe that would be a big national thing to do, to have a piece of artwork and music, something composed for every cathedral or bigger churches or little churches, even, to have a great overflowing of our cultural life to help us remember as well.
It's actually made me think I should see what our chaplaincy at work. I work in a hospital. Well, they might not be planning anything, but my manager manages our department and the chaplaincy, so we've got quite good links just by chance. And I went on some of the COVID wards today, and I was thinking, it's the staff who are on there full time, we just visit, are going to need some way of processing it afterwards. It's going to be quite traumatic, I think, and at the moment they're just surviving, like someone said. So I think there's going to be I always think hospital chaplaincy is quite underrated. Well, in our hospital, it's quite underrated, and the staff, there could be better links with the staff and the chaplains. Maybe this will be an opportunity to do that.
Diseases are a part of our world, and pandemics are a part of our world. And even though you could find a link between destruction of habitats and the jumping of illnesses, I'm not sure it's that clever to make a direct sort of judgmental statement about it. Because for some reason or other, God's created a world in which there are viruses, and those viruses attack humans and other animals. And so I suppose what I'm saying is I think it's important to think about these things on lots of different levels and not be simplistic. But I certainly think that the experience of the pandemic has perhaps humbled us, picking up on John's theme of humility, and that humility may enable us to live differently and in ways that give fullness of life, which Iona talked about incredibly powerfully in our breakout group around, yes, we want physical health, but the gospel offers us a much deeper story around what fullness of life is. So perhaps we can just draw out some more of our thinking, and there's so much process I think we need to go through, and that's probably why it's quite difficult to come up with an outcome. There are just some things we need to do, because we're human.
Here's an icon. It's a modern version, but the icon itself dates back to the 12th century. And yeah, it's a colourful icon of the raising of Lazarus.
It's quite a busy scene there, Andy. There's lots going on. What can we see? So I don't particularly like the way Mary and Martha are. They're the women, and they're sort of down on the ground there, looking particularly miserable. But I'm quite struck by that young boy. I think Lazarus stinks so much, he's holding something over his face, isn't he? I quite like that detail because of him smelling. But what do you make of Mary and Martha down there, Andy? What does that say to you?
Well, I mean, John 11 does say that Mary fell at Jesus's feet. So I suppose it's just very literally picking up that detail in the story. But yes, I agree. But I suppose that there's an element of so much grief that she can't stand.
Martha is quite a different character to Mary, isn't she? And certainly in the passage before, Martha's the one that's strong enough to go and meet Jesus. She has a conversation with him, and there's challenge in that conversation. And she's the first one to declare in the gospel narratives that Jesus is the Christ and the resurrection and the life. But Mary is perhaps the more empathetic character, the more has a slightly different relationship with Jesus, and he responds to her differently.
Yeah, so Martha can manage a theological conversation about resurrection, but with Mary, you know, she uses the same words as Martha. If you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But with her, Jesus doesn't argue, he just bursts into tears. And I love that Jesus knows how to treat different people differently as they need in their grief. And there's Jesus, and he's got his hand out, hasn't he? And he's saying, Lazarus, come out. And C.H. Spurgeon said, the reason that he doesn't say, come out, Lazarus, is if he put the words in that order, the whole graveyard would have emptied because everyone would have come out. So he had to say, Lazarus, It's you specifically I'm calling on to come out.
There's a big crowd of Jews with them in the story, isn't there? The friends. So there's a sense of a gathering and a crowd grieving with Mary and Martha, interestingly. So a community grieves together in a way that we're perhaps not so used to in our society.
This picture is from the Mafa community of northern Cameroon. And it's actually, I think, quite sort of strikingly similar to the icon, though I imagine it's independent of it, that we saw before.
It's more joyful, isn't it? It's beautifully joyful and more intimate in that way.
Yeah. What do people notice in this picture? Let's start with what's similar, and then we'll look at what's different. What are the similarities?
Well, in this one, there is a unity because everything is directed at Lazarus, whereas in the icon, there were 4 or 5, if not more, centres of attention, which didn't actually, to my mind, seem to be linked at all. This is a lovely picture. It's all, like, as Tina said, it's joyous and it's focused on one thing, really.
I wonder if that's because, I mean, I'm not a specialist in iconography at all. I wonder if the focus is usually on Jesus, and in that icon it didn't work because actually all the drama is focused on Lazarus, but perhaps they felt they had to focus on Jesus. So the painting is split in its attention, whereas this icon, if you like, or painting of the story has realized that the Lazarus resurrection is the point of attention that we should all be looking at, because that's where the hope of the resurrection is. So Jesus is present in that moment, which enables, and I suppose in this story they've chosen not to have both the grief and the joy, and so the other icon they've split it because they've tried to tell the narrative of both the grief and the joy, and this one's just focused, as you say quite rightly, on the joy, and they haven't got the grief, so they're only telling part of the story.
It looks like a miracle, doesn't it? And they're in, the younger kids are in shock.
Yeah.
And the older, they are more, they see it more as a miracle as well, in a way.
I mean, like Christian, the little kid, he's just, or she, I can't work out which, is just the wonder on their face.
We faced plague, contagion, the wrath of God. We've been in the tomb this week, but we've been pointing towards some sort of resurrection hope. So next week, maybe we can rejoice in that hope a little bit more together.